The question that unsettled Hollywood wasn't whether temptation exists, but what happens when someone actually risks everything for it. Behind carefully worded interviews and polished red carpet smiles, a far more uncomfortable narrative began to circulate quietly. Insiders described it as the moment when admiration crossed into something harder to contain. And at the center of that shift stood a name no one expected to hear spoken so cautiously. For years, Jamie Dornan was viewed as someone who kept his private life firmly protected. He rarely invited speculation, avoided controversy, and drew a clear line between work and family. That reputation made the whispers all the more jarring when they began surfacing in industry conversations. People weren't asking if something felt different, but when it had started to change. Those changes, according to sources, didn't arrive suddenly. They crept in through subtle adjustments, longer conversations behind the scenes, an ease that went beyond professional familiarity, and a growing reluctance to discuss certain topics publicly. It was the kind of shift that's hard to define, but impossible to miss once it's there. In Hollywood, those early signs often signal deeper complications ahead. The name most frequently attached to those observations was Dakota Johnson, not framed as a disruptor or a villain, but as a presence that altered dynamics in ways people struggled to explain. Those close to the situation noted how conversations changed tone when she was mentioned, how humor gave way to guarded pauses. That kind of reaction usually points to something unresolved. What made the situation particularly sensitive was timing. Dornan's public image rested heavily on stability, trust, and a carefully maintained separation between personal commitments and professional chemistry. Any perception of blurred boundaries carried weight far beyond gossip. Even the suggestion that someone might risk a marriage, emotionally or otherwise, was enough to raise alarms among those paid to protect reputations. Insiders emphasized that no dramatic confrontation marked this turning point. Instead, it was a series of decisions that suggested increasing emotional investment. Missed opportunities to distance, moments where discretion replaced transparency, and an unmistakable shift toward privacy. When people start protecting something quietly, it often means they believe there's something worth protecting. Those around Dornan reportedly noticed a growing tension between his public composure and private behavior. He became more selective with appearances, more cautious in interviews, and noticeably defensive when questions drifted too close to personal territory. None of it confirmed wrongdoing, but together it painted a picture of someone navigating internal conflict. In Hollywood, that struggle rarely stays invisible for long. The marriage at the center of this storm wasn't discussed openly, but its presence loomed over every conversation. Sources described concern not about scandal, but about consequences. Relationships built on trust can fracture long before anything becomes public, especially when secrecy enters the equation. The real risk wasn't headlines, it was what happens behind closed doors when priorities begin to shift. What complicated matters further was how resistant the story proved to dismissal. Attempts to frame everything as exaggerated fan speculation failed to quiet industry chatter. Instead, the narrative adapted, fueled by silence rather than statements. Each avoided question added another layer of intrigue, making it harder to believe there was nothing beneath the surface. Veterans of the entertainment world recognized the pattern immediately. These situations rarely explode overnight, they simmer, growing heavier with every unaddressed moment. The danger lies not in exposure, but in the gradual erosion of certainty. When someone appears willing to risk stability, observers naturally wonder what's compelling enough to justify that gamble. By the time the rumors reached wider circles, the framing had shifted. This was no longer about fleeting attraction or exaggerated chemistry. It was about perceived choice, about whether a connection had become significant enough to challenge existing boundaries. In Hollywood, that distinction changes everything. And that's where this story truly begins to unsettle. Because once the idea takes hold that someone is willing to risk a marriage, the conversation stops being hypothetical. It becomes a question of how far that risk was allowed to go, and who ultimately bears the cost when private decisions brush too close to the public eye. As the narrative intensified, attention quietly shifted from speculation to consequence. The industry wasn't asking whether boundaries had been tested, but what happens when perception alone begins to carry weight. In Hollywood, reputations are shaped as much by what people believe as by what can be proven. And belief, once formed, is notoriously difficult to reverse. Those closest to Jamie Dornan reportedly sensed the pressure long before it became visible. Conversations that once felt relaxed turned measured, and decisions were filtered through layers of caution. The instinct to protect didn't come across as strategic, it felt personal. When someone begins adjusting their entire environment, it usually signals that the stakes feel real to them. The focus soon narrowed to one central question: what was being protected, and from whom? Sources described an internal conflict between maintaining a carefully built public identity and navigating a connection that refused to remain simple. This wasn't about scandal management in the traditional sense. It was about minimizing damage to multiple lives intertwined by trust, expectation, and public scrutiny. As whispers spread, Dakota Johnson found herself at the center of a narrative she never publicly addressed. Insiders emphasized that the situation wasn't framed as blame, but as impact. Her presence, intentional or not, had become symbolic of a choice that carried risk. In Hollywood, symbols often become stories before facts ever catch up. The industry's response was telling in its restraint. No aggressive denials, no sudden appearances designed to redirect attention. Instead, there was a noticeable tightening of access, a recalibration of messaging, and an increased emphasis on privacy. These are not reactions to harmless rumors, they are measures taken when uncertainty threatens stability. Behind closed doors, conversations reportedly turned toward long-term consequences rather than immediate fallout. How does trust recover when silence replaces clarity? How does a relationship survive when every unspoken detail becomes a source of speculation? These questions mattered more than headlines, because they touched on realities no public statement could fix. Observers also noted how the narrative refused to collapse under time. Without new evidence, the story should have faded, yet it lingered, reshaped by each unanswered question. That persistence suggested something deeper than momentary intrigue. In Hollywood, the stories that endure are usually rooted in emotional truth, not just rumor. The most unsettling aspect was the absence of a clean resolution. No defining moment that could close the chapter, no decisive action that clarified intent. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of tension, built from restraint rather than revelation. That kind of unresolved pressure often leaves lasting marks, even when nothing is ever confirmed publicly. Industry veterans warned that the real exposure wasn't about names or accusations. It was about vulnerability, the moment when carefully maintained balance appears fragile. When someone is perceived as willing to risk what they have, the audience begins to reassess everything that came before. Trust, once questioned, alters the entire narrative. In the end, this story isn't defined by proof or denial. It's defined by the uncomfortable space between them, where assumptions grow and silence speaks loudly. Hollywood has seen countless rumors come and go, but the ones that linger usually do so for a reason. And when a private risk becomes a public question, the consequences rarely arrive all at once. They unfold, quietly and irrevocably, over time.